There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, like a Tuesday afternoon or a simple question asked between rooms. They carry no fanfare, no dramatic shift in the lighting to signal their importance. They are quiet intruders, slipping through the door you foolishly left unlocked, and only in retrospect, from the landscape of the future they create, can you see them for what they were: the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor before the earthquake. For me, that tremor was not a sound, but a sight, a question, and the sudden, shocking heat of steam on my skin that had nothing to do with the water pouring over my head. It was the sight of Sam, my roommate, my best friend, standing in the open doorway of the bathroom, a space that had always been governed by the unspoken treaty of closed doors and feigned ignorance. He wasn't silhouetted dramatically. The light from the hallway was soft, mundane, catching the worn fibers of the gray t-shirt he always slept in. He just stood there, his hand resting on the doorframe, his expression unreadable, and watched me. I had been lost in the drumming of the water, a daily baptism that washed away the lingering scent of darkroom chemicals and the low-grade anxiety that hummed just beneath my skin. The shower was my sanctuary, a 10-minute void where the world and its demands ceased to exist. In our small apartment, it was one of the few places where true privacy was absolute, a given. We were meticulous about it. A closed bathroom door was a sacred pact. You did not knock unless the building was on fire, and even then, you would probably apologize for the interruption. But there he was, violating the pact with such casual stillness that it felt less like an intrusion and more like a tear in the fabric of reality itself. My first thought, a panicked, animalistic jolt, was one of pure exposure. My body, which I navigated through the world with a photographer's detached awareness of form and line, suddenly felt like a raw, unveiled secret. The water sluicing over my shoulders and chest was no longer a comfort, but a transparent sheet that hid nothing. I froze, my hand halfway to the shampoo bottle, my back to him, every muscle tensed for a sound. A laugh, an apology, the click of the door closing. But none of that came. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with steam, and everything unsaid between us for the past 5 years. I could feel his gaze on me, not in a leering way, but with a strange, quiet intensity, like he was studying a difficult passage in a book. It traced the line of my spine, the slope of my shoulders, the places where I held my tension. I could have turned, could have yelled, could have covered myself. But I was paralyzed by a profound and terrifying curiosity. Why wasn't he leaving? The ordinary rules had been suspended, and I had no map for this new territory. And then, his voice, low and rough from sleep, cut through the rush of the water. It wasn't loud, but it landed with the force of a physical touch. Need help with your back? It was just a question. 6 simple words. But in the superheated, surreal atmosphere of that bathroom, they were a confession, a query, and a dare all at once. It wasn't an offer to scrub an unreachable spot. It was an offer to cross a line we had both spent years pretending wasn't there. It was an acknowledgement of the very intimacy we so carefully avoided. And in that moment, as I stood there with water streaming into my eyes, my heart hammering a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my ribs, the only thought that surfaced from the roaring confusion was not one of fear or anger, but a devastating, hopeful, and utterly insane question of my own. Was this, after all this time, finally happening? To understand the sheer magnitude of that question, you have to understand the foundation upon which it was built. You have to understand Sam. We met in a sophomore-level art history class, a prerequisite I was taking for my photography major and one he was taking to fulfill a humanities credit for his computer science degree. I was the quiet one in the back, observing, taking notes on the way light fell across the projected slides of Renaissance paintings. He was the one in the front row who wasn't afraid to ask the stupid questions, his curiosity genuine and unvarnished. He had a kind of effortless magnetism, a gravitational pull that drew people into his orbit. He was bright and loud in a way that wasn't obnoxious, just alive. His energy was like a sun flare next to my quiet, lunar calm. We were, by all accounts, an unlikely pairing. Our friendship began not with a bang, but with a slow, steady accretion of shared moments. It started with him borrowing my notes, which led to studying together in the library, which then bled into late-night conversations over lukewarm coffee in the campus cafe. I learned about his sprawling, chaotic family in Ohio. He learned about my quiet, solitary upbringing as an only child in a small coastal town. He spoke of code and algorithms with a passion I usually reserve for aperture settings and developing times. I found myself explaining the rule of thirds to him using salt and pepper shakers, and he listened with an attentiveness that was both flattering and, for me, deeply unnerving. I was used to being the observer, the one behind the camera, not the one in the frame. But Sam had a way of turning the lens back on me, of seeing me in a way I wasn't sure I was ready to be seen. My feelings for him were a quiet, insidious bloom. They didn't announce themselves. They simply took root in the fertile ground of our burgeoning friendship. It was in the way his laugh crinkled the corners of his eyes, the way he'd absent-mindedly run a hand through his already messy brown hair when he was concentrating, the way he'd show up at my door with takeout after he knew I'd spent 12 hours in the darkroom, too focused to remember to eat. These were small things, insignificant kindnesses that, for anyone else, would have just been signs of a good friend. For me, they were kindling. My affection for him became a secret room inside me, a place I furnished with carefully cataloged memories and unspoken hopes. I kept the door to that room firmly locked, terrified that he might one day stumble upon it, and, seeing the mess inside, run. After graduation, the decision to get an apartment together felt both incredibly natural and breathtakingly dangerous. It was a practical choice. The city was expensive, and we worked well as a unit. He had landed a demanding but lucrative job as a software consultant, and I was starting to build a freelance photography career. Our lives were a study in contrasts. His was a world of airports, conference rooms, and client dinners, of sharp suits and the constant ping of his work phone. Mine was a world of quiet studios, the acrid smell of fixer, the patient waiting for an image to emerge in the dim red light of the darkroom. He brought the world into our apartment, stories of different cities, fragments of other people's lives. I, in turn, offered him a sanctuary from it, a quiet harbor where the noise could finally fade. The apartment became our shared territory, a space mapped out with unspoken rules and comfortable routines. The living room was neutral ground, the kitchen a place of collaboration, our bedrooms sovereign states. And for years, it worked. It worked because I was disciplined. I treated my feelings for Sam like a chronic condition, one that had to be managed daily. I learned to parse his casual touches, a hand on my shoulder, a playful shove, as platonic. I became an expert in emotional compartmentalization. When he brought girlfriends home, I was the perfect, supportive roommate. I would smile, make pleasant conversation, and then retreat to my room, to that secret, locked space inside me, and quietly tend to the ache. I learned to live with the low, constant hum of yearning, the same way one learns to live with the sound of traffic in a city. It was just part of the background noise of my life. I convinced myself that this was enough. Having him in my life as a friend was a gift I wasn't willing to risk for the selfish, impossible dream of something more. The friendship was the masterpiece. My love was the flawed, hidden study I kept locked away in the dark. Sam, for his part, seemed to exist in a state of blissful ignorance. He moved through our shared life with an open, uncomplicated affection that was both a comfort and a quiet torture. He called me his rock, the calm in his storm. He seemed to have no idea that the ground beneath his feet was riddled with the fault lines of my hidden emotions. Or if he did, he never let on. He treated our bond as something precious, but purely platonic. He built walls around it just as I did, but as were made of different materials, an easy bro-ish camaraderie, a careful respect for my personal space, a complete and total avoidance of anything that might stray into ambiguous territory. We had constructed a perfect, stable friendship, a marvel of emotional architecture. But it was a structure built on a lie, or at least a profound omission. And I was the only one who knew how fragile the foundation truly was. The first tremor, the one that began the slow collapse of that carefully constructed edifice, was named Sarah. She was his longest relationship, a 2-year affair that seemed, from my observer's perch, both intensely passionate and deeply volatile. She was an architect, as driven and ambitious as he was, and their time together was a series of dramatic highs and explosive lows. Their fights were quiet, tense affairs that would suck the air out of the apartment, leaving a residue of bitter silence that would take days to dissipate. Their reconciliations were just as intense, marked by closed bedroom doors and the kind of charged quiet that felt louder than shouting. Through it all, I remained the neutral party, Switzerland in our domestic Cold War. I would make myself scarce during their battles, retreating to my darkroom or going for long, aimless walks with my camera, capturing the lonely beauty of the city at night. The end came not with a bang, but with a week of crushing, unbearable silence. Sam had been on a brutal project in Chicago, working 18-hour days, and the strain had frayed his nerves raw. He came home looking hollowed out, a ghost of the vibrant man I knew. He and Sarah had a conversation that I wasn't privy to, but I heard the click of the front door closing with a finality that was unmistakable. When I emerged from my room an hour later, I found him sitting on the couch in the dark, staring at the blank television screen. The only light was the cold, blue glow of the city filtering through the window. He didn't look sad, not in the way people do in movies. He just looked empty, like a house that had been cleared of all its furniture, leaving nothing but dust motes dancing in the faint light. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat. He didn't turn to look at me. "I'm sorry, Sam," I offered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He just shook his head, a small, tired movement. "Don't be. It was time. We were just breaking the same things over and over again." That was the beginning of the shift. The vibrant, outward-facing energy that had always defined him collapsed inward. He stopped going out. His friends would call, and he'd ignore his phone. The constant hum of his work emails and calls, once the soundtrack to our evenings, fell silent. He shed the skin of the high-flying consultant and became something quieter, more fragile. He started to drift, unmoored, through the spaces of our apartment. And in his drifting, he began to gravitate toward me. Not with words, but with proximity. He would sit in the kitchen while I cooked, not talking, just watching my hands as I chopped vegetables. He would follow me into the living room and sit on the other end of the couch while I edited photos, the rhythmic click of my mouse the only sound between us. I became his anchor in the quiet storm of his exhaustion and heartbreak. I didn't push. I didn't offer platitudes or advice. I simply let him be near me. I made him food he didn't ask for. I put on old movies we both loved, films whose dialogue we knew by heart. I offered him the silent, unwavering presence that was my native language. I was a photographer, after all. I knew how to wait. I knew how to be still and let the subject reveal itself in its own time. And I told myself this was just an extension of our friendship. I was being his rock, just as he'd always said I was. It was my duty. But a dangerous, treacherous part of me, the part that lived in that locked room, began to hope. It saw the cracks in his armor not as damage, but as an opening. The first time it happened, it was an accident. Or at least, it had the perfect disguise of one. We were on the couch, watching a ridiculously long historical epic, the kind we both secretly loved. It was late, well past midnight, and the city outside had finally quieted down. Sam had been silent for the better part of an hour, and I assumed he was just lost in the film. But when I glanced over, I saw that his eyes were closed, his head lolling at an uncomfortable angle against the back of the sofa. He was completely, deeply asleep, his face softened and vulnerable in the flickering light from the screen. He looked younger, stripped of the weariness that had clung to him for weeks. My first instinct was to wake him, to tell him to go to his own bed. It was the safe thing to do, the thing that respected the boundaries we had always maintained. But I hesitated. My heart was doing a slow, heavy drum roll in my chest. To wake him would be to break the spell, to send him back to his empty room, to the cold reality of his new solitude. So I did nothing. I just sat there, rigid, barely breathing, as if any movement might startle him away. After a few minutes, his head slumped sideways, slowly, inevitably, until it came to rest on my shoulder. The contact was electric. A jolt of heat shot through me, so intense I was sure it must have burned him. His hair, soft and smelling faintly of his ridiculously expensive shampoo, brushed against my neck. I could feel the gentle, rhythmic puff of his breath against my skin. The weight of his head on my shoulder was both a profound comfort and an exquisite torture. It was everything I had ever secretly wanted, delivered under the guise of plausible deniability. He was asleep. He didn't know what he was doing. It didn't mean anything. I repeated that mantra to myself over and over again, a desperate incantation against the rising tide of hope. It doesn't mean anything. But as the minutes bled into an hour, and I sat there, my own body aching with the stillness, I couldn't deny the truth. It meant everything. My shoulder, my entire side, had become a sanctuary for him. I could feel the tension slowly seeping out of him as he slept, his body relaxing into mine. It was the most intimate we had ever been, a silent, unconscious confession of need on his part, and a secret, agonizing fulfillment of it on mine. When the movie ended and the credits rolled, casting the room in a stark, monochrome light, I knew I should move. But I couldn't. I was pinned by the weight of his trust, and by the terrifying, beautiful weight of my own long-buried desires. I ended up falling asleep like that, contorted and uncomfortable, my neck stiff, but with his head still resting on my shoulder, a warm, solid presence in the quiet dark. That night marked the beginning of the ritual. What began as a supposed accident slowly, deliberately, became a routine. The next night, as we settled onto the couch, he didn't even pretend to be interested in the movie. He just picked up a throw pillow, placed it against my side, and laid his head down, closing his eyes. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask. He just did it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My entire body went rigid. The plausible deniability was gone. This was intentional. This was a choice. I stared at the television screen, my eyes unseeing, my mind racing. What was this? What was he asking for? Was he just using me for comfort, a convenient, warm body to ward off the loneliness? Or was it something more? The questions circled endlessly, a flock of vultures in my mind. Every night, it was the same. We would finish dinner, clean the kitchen in our usual companionable silence, and then migrate to the living room. And every night, he would fold himself against me on the couch. Sometimes he would talk, his voice a low murmur against my shoulder, telling me about his day, the frustrations of a new project, the lingering awkwardness of untangling his life from Sarah's. Other times, he would be silent, and I would feel him fall asleep, his breathing evening out into a slow, steady rhythm that I started to memorize. I became a student of his closeness. I learned the exact weight of his arm when he draped it over my stomach, the way his fingers would sometimes twitch in his sleep, the soft, almost inaudible sigh he would make just before drifting off. My world, which had once been measured in f-stops and shutter speeds, was now measured in these tiny, intimate details. My life became a paradox. By day, I was a professional, meeting with clients, scouting locations, losing myself in the technical precision of my work. I was in control. But by night, I was a willing captive, caught in a state of suspended animation on our couch. My own exhaustion became a constant companion. I was sleeping in fragmented, uncomfortable positions, but I would have rather endured 1,000 sleepless nights than give up that proximity. It was a dangerous addiction. Each night was a dose of a potent drug that left me feeling euphoric and hollowed out at the same time. The hope it engendered was a cruel, beautiful thing. It was like developing a photograph in the darkroom, watching an image slowly emerge in the chemical bath. You can see the outlines, the suggestion of a face, a landscape, but you have to wait, holding your breath, to see if it will resolve into something beautiful or fade into a disappointing, murky gray. I was waiting for the image of us to resolve, terrified of what I might see. The ritual began to escalate, bleeding out from the confines of the living room. One night, after a particularly grueling week, he knocked on my bedroom door. It was late, close to 2 a.m. I was in bed, reading, the small circle of light from my lamp a lonely island in the dark. Leo, his voice was hesitant, small. I opened the door. He was standing there in his sleep pants and t-shirt, his hair a mess, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked lost. "Can't sleep," he mumbled, looking at the floor. "Nightmares. Just a lot on my mind." My heart did a painful, hopeful lurch. "Do you want to talk?" He shook his head. "No. Can I just stay in here? For a little while." The question hung in the air between us, fragile and heavy. He wasn't asking to talk. He wasn't asking for advice. He was asking for presence. He was asking to not be alone. This was a new threshold, a door I had always kept firmly closed. My bedroom was my final fortress, the one place that was unequivocally mine. Letting him in felt like a surrender. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He slipped into the room and didn't sit in the chair or on the floor. He walked to the other side of my bed, lifted the covers, and slid in, keeping a careful, respectful distance, his back to me. The space between us felt like a chasm, a vast, empty canyon charged with a silent, crackling energy. Neither of us moved. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my body humming with a high-frequency tension. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gap. I could hear every breath he took. This was no longer about plausible deniability. This was a deliberate act, a conscious choice to shatter the last remaining boundary between us. We lay like that for what felt like hours, two statues in the dark, until eventually, his breathing deepened. I stayed awake long after, listening to the sound of him sleeping safely in my bed, and wondered if I was living in a dream or a tragedy. This became the new, unspoken addition to the ritual. On the nights when the weight of the world seemed too much for him, there would be that soft knock on my door, the quiet request, and the shared, silent space of my bed. The distance between us and the bed began to shrink, incrementally, night by night. A hand brushing mine as one of us shifted, a foot accidentally touching the other's. Each touch was a tiny explosion in the silent dark. Then one night, he rolled over in his sleep and threw an arm over my waist, pulling himself flush against my back, his face buried in the space between my shoulder blades. He sighed, a sound of deep, profound contentment, and settled in. I lay there, my body a rigid line of shock and bliss, every nerve ending screaming. This was it. This was the point of no return. He was holding me. He was holding me as if it was his right, as if it was where he belonged. And the most terrifying part was that it felt like it was where he belonged. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. I lived in this state of exquisite, agonizing ambiguity for weeks. The days were a blur of work, the nights a hyper-real series of moments I would dissect and analyze until dawn. I was a detective searching for clues, a scholar interpreting a sacred, confusing text. Did the way he held my hand in his sleep mean something different from the way he rested his head on my shoulder? Was the sigh he let out when he settled against me a sigh of comfort, or just unconsciousness? I was drowning in a sea of subtlety, and I was terrified to ask for a lifeline. To speak of it would be to break the spell. To name it would be to risk its annihilation. So I remained silent, the quiet observer, documenting the slow, tectonic shift in the landscape of our friendship, all while my own inner world was being torn apart and rebuilt, night after night. And that brings us back to the shower. That Tuesday, he had just returned from a 3-day trip, and the exhaustion was rolling off him in visible waves. I had heard him come in, the weary drop of his bags by the door, and had retreated to the bathroom for my own ritual of washing the day away. I had been so lost in my own world that I didn't even hear him approach. And then he was there, in the doorway, a silent spectator to my most private moment. The steam, the water, the shocking vulnerability. And his question, "Need help with your back?" It was a question loaded with the weight of all those nights on the couch, all those silent hours in my bed. It was the culmination of the ritual, the final, spoken acknowledgement of the intimacy we had been cultivating in the dark. I stood there for a lifetime, my back to him, the water beating down on me. My mind was a whiteout of panic and a blinding, brilliant flare of hope. This was the moment. The image in the developing tray was finally coming into focus. I could turn around and laugh it off, make a joke, and retreat back to the safety of our old boundaries. I could preserve the friendship, this precious, fragile thing I had guarded for so long. Or I could turn around and accept the offer. Not the offer to wash my back, but the offer of something more, something terrifying and beautiful that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Every instinct screamed at me to choose safety, to protect what I had. But the part of me that had been locked away for so long, the part that had been starving for a single drop of real, acknowledged affection, was tired of waiting in the dark. Slowly, deliberately, I turned off the water. The sudden silence was deafening, amplifying the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. Water dripped from my hair into my eyes. I didn't turn to face him. Not yet. I just stood there, in the silence, letting my action be my first answer. I heard a soft sound behind me, the shuffle of his feet on the bath mat. He was moving closer. The air, already thick with steam, became charged, electric. I felt his presence right behind me, the heat of his body near my skin. He didn't touch me. He just stood there, waiting for my next move. This was a conversation without words, a negotiation of trust and desire in the silent, dripping space of the bathroom. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that I could no longer be just the observer. I had to become a participant. I had to step into the frame. I reached for a towel, my movements slow, measured. I wrapped it around my waist, a flimsy barrier in a room where all barriers had already been demolished. And then, finally, I turned to face him. He was closer than I expected. So close I could see the faint, dark stubble on his jaw, the confusion and a raw, naked vulnerability in his brown eyes that mirrored my own. He looked just as scared as I felt. His hand was still on the doorframe, but his body was angled toward me, a question in his very posture. The gray t-shirt he wore was damp in patches from the steam. He swallowed, his throat moving, and for a second, I thought he was going to bolt, to shatter the moment with an apology and retreat back to the safety of the hallway. But he didn't. He held my gaze, his own eyes searching mine for an answer, for permission. The silence stretched on, a taut wire between us. My entire world had contracted to this small, steamy room, to the space between his body and mine. All the years of friendship, all the nights of silent yearning, all the fear and all the hope, it had all led to this. To a single, unspoken question hanging in the air. He had walked through the door. He had asked the question. Now the choice was mine. I could send him away, or I could invite him to stay. That night, the apartment was a different country. The air itself felt rearranged, the familiar spaces charged with a new, volatile energy. After the moment in the bathroom, I had retreated to my room to dress, my hands shaking so badly I could barely button my shirt. Sam had disappeared into his own room. There was no confrontation, no resolution, just the quiet click of two separate doors closing, creating a silence that was heavier and more profound than any we had shared before. It wasn't the comfortable silence of companionship, it was the tense, humming silence of a live wire. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the grain of the wooden floor, trying to piece together what had just happened, what it meant. His question, "Need help with your back?" echoed in my head, but it was the look in his eyes that I couldn't shake. It wasn't a look of casual curiosity or misplaced bravado. It was a look of profound, desperate inquiry. He was asking for something, and I was terrified that I finally understood what it was. We avoided each other for hours. I heard him moving around in the kitchen, the clink of a glass, the soft thud of the refrigerator door. I stayed in my room, ostensibly editing photos, but really just staring at the same image on my screen, my mind a churning vortex of what-ifs. What if I had misinterpreted everything? What if it was just a strange, thoughtless comment, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by his exhaustion? The thought was a cold spike of dread in my gut. The risk of being wrong was colossal. It wasn't just my own heart on the line. It was the entire ecosystem of our life together. The friendship, the home we had built, the easy, comfortable rhythm of our days. It was all balanced on the knife's edge of this new, terrifying ambiguity. The quiet observer in me was screaming warnings, telling me to retreat, to rebuild the walls, to pretend nothing had happened. But the man who had turned off the water in the shower couldn't go back. Eventually, hunger and the need to break the stalemate drove me from my room. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch in the exact same spot he always did, but the space beside him, my space, felt miles away. He was staring at his phone, but his thumb was still, not scrolling. He was hiding in the blue light of the screen. I walked to the kitchen and started making dinner, my movements automated and clumsy. I could feel his eyes on me, but when I glanced over, he would quickly look back down at his phone. The air was thick with things we weren't saying. The simple act of chopping an onion felt like a monumental task. Every sound, the sizzle of oil in the pan, the scrape of a knife on the cutting board, was amplified in the suffocating quiet. We ate dinner sitting at our small kitchen table, the silence a third person between us. Usually, our meals were filled with easy chatter, a recap of our days. Tonight, the only sounds were the clinking of our forks against the plates. I kept my eyes on my food, studying the arrangement of pasta on my plate as if it were a complex work of art. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him and demand to know what was happening in his head, but I was paralyzed by the fear of his answer. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I spoke. "Are you okay?" The words came out softer than I intended, almost a whisper. He looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten I was there. He put his fork down. "Yeah, just tired. Long trip." It was a flimsy excuse, a paper-thin wall he was trying to erect between us, but I knew it was all he had. "Sam," I said, my voice gaining a bit of strength. I met his eyes across the table. "What happened in the bathroom wasn't about you being tired." He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He broke eye contact, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were clenched in his lap. "I don't know, Leo. I shouldn't have. It was weird. I'm sorry." "Were you sorry?" I pressed, a new, unfamiliar boldness rising in me. This was it, the moment of truth. "Or were you scared?" He didn't answer for a long time. He just sat there, staring at his own tightly knotted fingers. The silence stretched, and this time, I let it. I wouldn't fill it with platitudes or let him retreat. I had turned off the water. I had faced him. I wouldn't back down now. When he finally looked up, his eyes were shining with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It was a mix of fear, confusion, and a deep, gut-wrenching sadness. "Both?" he whispered, the word barely audible. "I think both." That single word was everything. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't a joke. It was a confession. A confession of his own confusion, his own fear. It was the confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the charge in the air, the question behind the question. We finished the rest of our meal in a new kind of silence. It was still tense, but it was honest. The lie of our platonic safety net was gone, and we were both free-falling, with no idea where we would land. Later, we found ourselves on the couch, drawn there by habit. But the ritual was broken. He didn't lean against me. He sat at the far end, his body angled away, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm that had opened between us. We put on a movie, but neither of us was watching. The tension was a living thing in the room, coiling and uncoiling in the space between our bodies. I could feel his restlessness, the nervous energy radiating from him. He kept picking up his phone, then putting it down. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was deeply unsettled. Halfway through the film, he stood up abruptly. I'm gonna turn in," he said, his voice strained. "Early start tomorrow," another excuse. He started to walk toward his room, and a cold wave of panic washed over me. I couldn't let it end like this. I couldn't let him retreat behind his door, leaving us in this unbearable limbo. If we went to our separate rooms tonight, I feared we might never find our way back to each other, not even to the friendship we had before. The risk of losing him completely was suddenly more terrifying than the risk of being rejected. "Sam, wait," I said, my voice stopping him in his tracks. He turned, his hand on the hallway wall, his back mostly to me. I stood up and walked toward him, my heart pounding a deafening rhythm in my ears. I stopped a few feet away. "Don't go," I said softly. "Don't run away from this." "From me." He slowly turned to face me fully. The dim light of the living room cast his face in shadows, making him impossible to read. "Leo, I don't know what this is," he said, his voice raw with frustration. "I don't know what I'm doing. I feel like I'm going crazy. Everything is confusing." "I know," I said, taking another step closer. We were standing in the narrow entrance to the hallway, the architecture of our apartment forcing us into a proximity that was both suffocating and electric. "It's confusing for me, too. But the one thing I'm not confused about is that I don't want you to walk away." I looked at him, really looked at him, letting all the years of carefully guarded emotion finally show in my eyes. I let him see the hope, the fear, the profound and unshakable affection I had for him. I was laying my cards on the table, all of them. It was the biggest gamble of my life. He stared back at me, his own eyes wide, searching mine. He looked from my eyes to my mouth and back again. The air grew thin, heavy. It felt like the moment before a lightning strike, the world holding its breath. His gaze was so intense, so full of a dawning, terrifying realization. He took a small, hesitant step forward, closing the last bit of distance between us. He was so close now I could feel his breath on my face. It was warm and unsteady. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. And then, He asked the question that changed everything, the question that finally, definitively, crossed the line. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his eyes locked on mine, full of a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "If I kissed you?" The question was a gift. It wasn't a demand, not a presumption. It was an offering of choice, a final, crucial act of respect for me, for our friendship. He was giving me the power, the final say. He was asking for permission to detonate the bomb we had been circling for weeks. And in his eyes, I saw the answer to all my unspoken questions. I saw the same fear, the same hope, the same desperate, aching need that had been living inside me for years. He wasn't using me for comfort. He wasn't confused about me. He was confused about himself, about what it meant to feel this way. But the feeling itself was real. It was there, shining out of him, raw and undeniable. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my mind blissfully, terrifyingly blank. Instead, I lifted my hand, my fingers trembling slightly, and gently cupped the side of his face. His skin was warm, the faint roughness of his stubble a grounding, real texture beneath my palm. He leaned into my touch, his eyes fluttering closed for a fraction of a second, a silent surrender. And that was my answer. That was my yes. He closed the remaining inch between us, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was hesitant, soft, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question, a discovery. It was the taste of salt from my own tears, which I hadn't even realized were falling. It was the feeling of a pressure valve being released after years of being tightened. It was the quiet, earth-shattering confirmation that the image in the developing tray was real, that it was more beautiful and terrifying than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. In that kiss, 5 years of unspoken words, of stolen glances, of carefully maintained distances, all collapsed into a single, perfect, terrifying point of contact. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of a conversation we were both, finally, ready to have. The aftermath of a beginning is often more chaotic than the end of something else. The kiss hadn't solved anything. It had simply changed the nature of the questions. We broke apart slowly, reluctantly, and stood there in the dim hallway, our foreheads resting against each other. His breathing was as ragged as mine. The silence that fell wasn't tense anymore. It was fragile, shimmering, like thin ice over a deep, dark lake. We had stepped onto the ice, and we could both feel it creaking beneath our feet. "So," he breathed, the word a puff of warm air against my lips. "That happened." I let out a shaky laugh, a sound that was half relief and half hysteria. "Yeah, it did." We didn't say much more. Words felt inadequate, clumsy tools for the delicate, momentous thing that had just occurred. He took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, a simple, declarative gesture that felt more significant than any vow. He led me not to his room, but to mine. This time, there was no pretext of nightmares or loneliness. This time, when he slid into my bed, he turned to face me. He pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me, and held me with a certainty that belied the confusion he'd confessed to earlier. I buried my face in his chest, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of him, a scent that was now inextricably linked with this new, terrifying reality. I fell asleep in his arms, not to the sound of his breathing from a safe distance, but to the steady, solid beat of his heart against my ear. I woke to an empty bed. The first conscious thought I had was of the warmth that was no longer beside me. The space he had occupied was already cool. It felt too fragile, too impossible to have survived the harsh light of day. But then I saw it. A piece of paper, torn from a notebook, sitting on his pillow. My heart seized. A note. Notes were for endings, for apologies, for running away. I picked it up with a trembling hand. The writing was his familiar, messy scrawl. Had to go in early. Project emergency. Talk later, that was it. No, I love you. No, last night was amazing. No, we need to figure this out. Just a bland, practical excuse. Talk later. The two most ambiguous words in the English language. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, began to seep into me. He had panicked. He had woken up in the morning, seen what he had done, and he had run. The kiss, the embrace, it had all been a momentary lapse, a response to loneliness and stress. And I, in my hopeful idiocy, had been a convenient port in a storm. The observer was right after all. I had stepped into the frame, and in doing so, I had ruined the composition entirely. The apartment felt cavernous, hostile. The silence that had once been a comfort was now an accusation. Every object, the couch, the kitchen table, the bathroom door, was a monument to my foolishness. I spent the day in a fog of misery and self-recrimination. I tried to work, but the faces in my photographs looked mocking. I tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash. I replayed every moment, every touch, every word, searching for the clue I had missed, the warning sign I had ignored. His confusion, his fear, I had seen it as a prelude to acceptance. Now I saw it for what it was, a giant, flashing red light. He wasn't ready. He might never be ready. And I had pushed him, or let him push himself, over a cliff he had no intention of jumping from. He didn't come home that night. A text message arrived around 10 o'clock. Still at the office. Pulling an all-nighter. Don't wait up. The efficiency of it was brutal. He was hiding in his work, the one place I couldn't follow him. The place that had always been his excuse and his escape. The next day was the same. And the next. We communicated through terse, functional text messages. He was a ghost in our own home. I would hear him come in late at night, long after I was in bed, and he would be gone before I woke up. He was avoiding me, and he was using the most impenetrable armor he had, his job. The hope that had bloomed so brilliantly in me withered and died. In its place, a cold, hard anger began to form. It wasn't just my own heart he had broken. He had broken our friendship. He had taken something beautiful and sacred, our years of trust and companionship, and treated it like it was disposable. He had used my deepest vulnerability, my love for him, as a temporary balm for his own loneliness, and now that he felt better, or perhaps just more scared, he was discarding it. The silence was no longer something to be endured. It was a weapon he was using against me, and I wouldn't let him. I had been a passive observer for too long. I had been a silent sanctuary for too long. I deserved more than a note and a text message. I deserved an explanation. I deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurt. On the fourth day of his absence, I waited for him. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't hide in my room. I sat on the couch in the dark, the same way he had after Sarah left, and I waited. The hours ticked by. Midnight. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. Finally, I heard the sound of his key in the lock. The door opened, and he stepped inside, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that looked bone deep. He was so focused on being quiet, on slipping past my door unnoticed, that he didn't see me at first. He dropped his bag and took off his shoes, and then he turned and finally saw me sitting there, a dark shape in the faint glow of the city lights. He froze. "Leo," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and surprise. "You're still up. We need to talk," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was hard, stripped of all its previous softness. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and ran a hand over his face. "I know. I'm sorry. This project is killing me." "Stop," I said, my voice sharp enough to make him flinch. "Stop using your job as a shield. You've been hiding from me for 4 days, Sam. Hiding in our own home. You kiss me, you hold me all night, and then you leave a note like you're reminding me to buy milk. You owe me more than that." He sank down into the armchair across from me, his body deflating as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He looked defeated. "You're right," he whispered, his eyes on the floor. "You're right. I'm a coward. I don't need you to be a hero," I said, my voice cracking despite my anger. "I just need you to be honest. If it was a mistake, just say it. If you regret it, just tell me. I can take it. What I can't take is this. This silence. This disappearing act. It's cruel." Tears started to well in his eyes, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. They traced paths through the exhaustion on his face. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice thick. "That's the problem. It was the most honest thing I think I've ever done, and it terrifies me." He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Leo, all my life, I've had a map. Go to college, get a good job, meet a nice girl, get married. It was all laid out. You were on that map, too. You were my best friend, my rock. The one constant, stable thing in my life. And then, I don't know when it happened, the map started to feel wrong. The lines started to blur, especially after Sarah left. I was so lost. And the only place I felt safe, the only place that felt like north, was next to you." He took a shaky breath. I didn't understand it. I just knew I needed to be near you. On the couch, in your room. It was like I couldn't breathe right when you weren't there. And then I kissed you. And it was like, for the first time, I was seeing the world in color. And it was beautiful. But it was also terrifying, because it meant my whole map was wrong. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, it was all gone. And I woke up that next morning, next to you, and I felt this overwhelming joy, and right behind it was this tidal wave of panic. Who am I? If I'm this person, what does this mean? I didn't know how to face you, how to face myself. So I ran. I ran to the one place where the map still made sense. Work. His confession, raw and painful, washed over me, extinguishing my anger and leaving a profound, aching empathy in its place. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. He hadn't been cruel. He had been terrified. He hadn't been using me. He had been discovering a part of himself he never knew existed, and it had broken him. I had been so wrapped up in my own hurt that I hadn't considered the depth of his crisis. For me, loving him was a long-held truth. For him, it was a cataclysmic revelation that threatened to rewrite his entire identity. I got up from the couch and went to him, kneeling on the floor in front of his chair. I took his hands, which were cold and trembling, in mine. "You don't have to have a map," I said softly. Sometimes you just have to navigate by the stars." He let out a watery, broken laugh. "You and your metaphors," he said, but he squeezed my hands. "What if I get us lost? Then we'll be lost together," I said. "That's better than you being lost alone, isn't it? Or me being lost alone." I looked up at him, my own tears finally falling. "You're my north, too, Sam. You have been for a long time." That was the real beginning. Not the kiss, but the confession. The shared vulnerability in the dark of our living room, surrounded by the ruins of our old friendship. It was there, in that wreckage, that we began to build something new. It wasn't a house built on a neat, predictable map. It was something more like a shelter, built by hand, piece by piece, from the honest, sturdy materials of fear and hope and a love that had, against all odds, survived the silence. The days that followed were a process of careful, intentional rediscovery. We were learning a new language, or rather, learning to speak the same language we always had, but with a new, shared understanding of what the words meant. The architecture of our home began to change. The doors to our bedrooms were no longer boundaries between two separate lives, but simply doors. Some nights he slept in his room, some nights in mine. And sometimes, I would wake in the middle of the night and find him standing in my doorway, just watching me sleep, and instead of feeling a jolt of panic, I would feel a profound sense of peace. I would lift the covers in a silent invitation, and he would slide in beside me, and we would hold each other until morning. The couch, once a site of so much tension and ambiguity, became a place of simple, uncomplicated comfort. We would watch movies, and he would lay his head in my lap, and I would run my fingers through his hair, and there were no more questions. There was no more analysis. It was just a fact, a comfortable, established truth. This is what we do. This is who we are. His need for my presence, which had once been a confusing, desperate signal, was now just a part of the texture of our life together. And my quiet observation, once a defense mechanism, became a form of active love. I still watched him, but now I wasn't just cataloging details for a secret room. I was learning the man I loved, the man who was learning to love me back. One rainy Saturday, I was working in my darkroom, the small, windowless space that had always been my most solitary sanctuary. The red light cast everything in a warm, womb-like glow. I was lost in the familiar, meditative process of developing a print, watching an image of a city street at dawn emerge from the blank paper. The door creaked open, and a sliver of white light cut through the red haze before Sam quickly shut it behind him. "Sorry," he whispered into the dark. "Didn't want to ruin anything." "It's okay," I whispered back, my eyes still on the tray. "It's past the crucial stage." He came to stand beside me, his presence filling the small space. He didn't speak, just watched as I gently agitated the tray, my hands moving with practiced ease. The image resolved, the lines of the buildings sharpening, the faint light of the sunrise blooming over the horizon. "It's like magic," he murmured, his voice full of awe. "Watching something appear out of nowhere." "It's not nowhere," I said, lifting the print with a pair of tongs and moving it to the stop bath. "It was always there, in the negative. Latent. You just have to have the right chemistry and the patience to wait for it to show itself. He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel his gaze on me in the dim red light. A latent image, he said, testing the words. I think I know what that feels like. I turned to look at him then. His face, illuminated by the strange, intimate light of the darkroom, was open and peaceful. The confusion and fear that had haunted his eyes for so long were gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that mirrored my own. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from my forehead. His touch was steady, sure. "Can I help?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it echoed his first, life-altering one. Not, "Need help with your back?" but "Can I help?" An offer not to fix, but to participate, to be a part of my world, even this small, dark, secret part of it. "Here," I said, handing him the tongs. "Take this one out of the fixer in about 3 minutes and move it to the water bath." Gently. And so he did. He stood beside me in the quiet, red-lit dark, my sanctuary that was now our sanctuary, and he learned. He learned to be patient, to be gentle, to wait for the image to emerge. And I watched him, this brilliant, vibrant man who had stumbled into my life and then stumbled into love, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The world outside, with its maps and its demands and its noise, could wait. In here, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we had everything we needed. We were no longer just observers or initiators. We were co-creators, developing a new picture of a life together, an image that was finally, beautifully, coming into focus.